Heather Petrocelli, interviewing the Honorable Janice Wilson on July 16th, 2015 in Portland at PSU, Portland State University. Janice, do I have permission to record you for the Carole Pope Oral History Project?
You do.
Would you please state your full name, date, and place of birth?
Janice Rose Wilson, April 14th, 1954, Medford, Oregon.
Oregonian.
Native born.
Yeah. I've been starting all the interviews basically asking people how they first came to know either Carole Pope or Our New Beginnings.
I first met Carole in connection with a lawsuit sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union concerning the censorship of inmate mail. Rick Hazelton was a lawyer at the law firm I had just joined, Lindsay Hart, Neal and Weigler. Rick and I had met when we were both clerking for federal judges. So in the fall of 1981, I came to the firm and Rick told me about this lawsuit he was working on for the ACLU and asked if I wanted to help. And it sounded interesting, so I said sure. And he introduced me to some of the people who were involved. It involved, as I said, the censorship of mail at the Oregon prisons, and it was a class action, so there were representatives, both inmates at each of the prisons and people outside the prison who were corresponding with the inmates. Carole had started out, I believe, it was before my time, I believe she had started out as a plaintiff when she was still in the prison, and she was a paralegal in the women's prison. She was out on parole when I first met her, so she'd switched over to being part of the class that was corresponding with the inmates. So Rick introduced me to Carole, as well as inmates, all the inmates who were participating in the lawsuit. So that's how I met Carole.
Do you have memories of your first impressions of Carole?
She was a very intense, very bright, clearly very bright, very articulate. I knew she was well educated, but at the same time a little rough around the edges. I mean, she was an ex-con. She would call herself an ex-con. So there was that aspect too. She was very intriguing. And although it wasn't directly related to the lawsuit, you couldn't meet Carole without learning very early on about her dream and her goal with Our New Beginnings.
So by the time you met her, Our New Beginnings was already a little fledgling in her hand?
It was. This again, this is before my time, so this is based on this Carole's story. But the story, as Carole told it to me, was that New Beginnings was formally legally incorporated when Carole was still in prison. The paperwork forming the corporation was smuggled out of the prison by a part-time counselor, who I will not name, to take to the Secretary of State's office so that it could be incorporated. So Our New Beginnings was incorporated when Carole was still in prison, and I'm sure you've heard the story, but I'll tell you too, if you like, about what the impetus was behind the formation of New Beginnings. But at the time I met Carole in the fall of '81, she was working for a living as a paralegal at a small law firm, English and Metcalf. She was an investigator and paralegal for them, and was devoting all of the rest of her time to trying to get Our New Beginnings off the ground. At the time, there was an organization called Northwest Ex-Offenders, which was men out of prison, trying to help each other and support each other as folks got out. She knew some of them, and they had some office space on the mezzanine floor of what was then the J.K. Gill building downtown. It then became the Gladys McCoy building later. And they had given her a little corner of their mezzanine area, and she had a desk and some boxes of donated clothing for women coming out of prison. So that was the status of Our New Beginnings when we first met.
So after you met her, Our New Beginnings already, had a little bit of a history going. Did she have an office space? She was still, so you said she was at the Office of English, and is that Catherine English?
Catherine English, yes, and Janet Metcalf.
Metcalf.
Mm-hmm.
How did you? The reason I'm asking is that I know that in her oral history, she says that you became partially the legal counsel for Our New Beginnings. So how did your relationship continue with her after the ACLU place? was closed? Is that the
Well, it took a
terminology?
while for the ACLU case to get resolved. It was resolved ultimately by a consent decree. But I was so intrigued and impressed with Carol's vision and goals with regard to New Beginnings. I wanted to help. That was part of the power that Carole had, and part of the power that her vision had, is that hardly anybody she met or talked to about it who didn't say wow and want to help. Carole Pope was the most charismatic person I have ever known personally in my life. I'm sure there are people out there who are equally or more charismatic in the wider world, but in my personal experience in my life, she's the most charismatic person I ever met. She just, the passion, the fire she had was contagious. You hear her talk about the problems of women coming out of prison and cycling over and over again, which is why New Beginnings was founded in the first place. Carole herself came out on parole, violated that parole, was revoked, and went back to prison. And she saw that happening over and over again. And we know recidivism is a huge problem. And so the inmates themselves were talking about the lack of support and how could they help each other stay out once they got out. There was already this organization for men, but as with so much in the criminal justice system, the women were just completely overshadowed by the men. I've said before that the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, the women's prison in Salem, was both literally and metaphorically in the shadow of the Oregon State Penitentiary. And resources for job training and education and so on and so forth within the prison were just minuscule compared to what was available for the men. And the same thing was true for resources when people got out. And you layer on top of that all the cultural and societal reactions to women offenders. And it just is much more complicated. Men are much more likely to have family and community resources on the outside when they come out. Not all of them do, obviously they need a lot of support too, but they're more likely to have those resources to a family that welcomes them back or something than women are. So the needs were great, the needs were somewhat different, and so there's this, how can we keep people from, these women from just recycling over and over and over again and reclaim their lives. So
what did you, for your expertise, how did you help?
Well, most of my assistance really early on wasn't legal. I mean, it was moral support. Carole and I became involved personally. I, helped her, financially. I helped New Beginnings probably financially as New Beginnings grew, and my expertise was litigation, which fortunately New Beginnings wasn't involved in, but I was at a firm that had lots of other expertise. So when it came to negotiating a lease for space, I got help with that at the firm, and that kind of legal advice.
Yeah, she did say in her oral history at one point that you pulled them out of one of their first early financial crises with personal support of paying phone bills off, that kind of thing. So.
I probably.
I'm just curious, kind of just backing something up just more out of curiosity because of what you have done for many years now as a judge. I know that she went in, when she went to her court date for theft and forgery, I know that the recommendation, which I'm not 100% sure how that works, but the recommendation was supposed to be probation and restitution. But she physically walked in and got a 10-year sentence for a $2,300 theft and forgery charge. In your purview of what you've done, was that extreme? It sounds extreme from my point of view, but I just don't know.
Yes. Now, of course, we have sentencing guidelines for felonies now that weren't in existence when Carole was convicted. So the judge had much broader discretion. The maximum penalty for each of the two counts that she faced, they're both C felonies, so the maximum penalty was 5 years. But for a first-time offender, for a property crime, a C felony, that was extreme. That was very much extreme, even for those days. Now, in those days, too, a judge might say they want somebody to get some prison time. They knew that the parole board would apply the matrix, and the prosecutor would look good saying, give her the maximum. The judge would look good giving the maximum. They both knew this person going to prison was going to be out in 6 months because they'd be matrixed by the parole board. So that was part of what was behind the sentencing guidelines was truth in sentencing. There are other reasons too, but even so, in those days, it really was extreme. And obviously I wasn't there at the time, don't know what the details were, but the story that Carole told me, which rings true, is that the judge just thought there is no excuse for someone with your level of education, your job skills, and so on and so forth, to have committed this crime. Whether or not the fact that she was a lesbian and this was her partner from whom she had stolen the money was a factor for the judge, who knows?
She thinks it was. I know that from her.
Right.
And I'm also curious if you just, from, I think, I know it was before your time with Carole, but I'm just curious, in your experience, she had made a comment that they put a H on her uniform for homosexual. Is that something that you know is practiced in?
I don't know on the prison uniform. I don't know that. I never saw that. She refers to it on her. You'll hear the reference to her jacket, and that doesn't mean uniform. So if she said there was an H on my jacket, that means her file, not her uniform. And there probably was that notation on the file. I never saw any of the prison inmates' files personally, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. I would expect that probably in terms of inmate management, they did have that kind of a notation on inmate files.
Decoding it for me. She does say on her jacket. I just always assumed that was clothing.
Right, no jackets to the file.
Okay. Right. Those are things I just kind of wanted you to clear up, just because I've always been curious, and when you have someone's expertise. Now, moving back to Our New Beginnings, you and Carole became personally involved. You did help with, sounds like, moral support, some financial support. What were your... Did you have daily or weekly interactions with the actual, physical space of Our New Beginnings? Probably
not daily, but probably at least weekly. And it went from the little desk over in the corner on the mezzanine of the Guild building to I don't even remember how this happened exactly, but they got a small house. I think it was in Northeast Portland. I was definitely more involved when they got the house at 18th and Hoyt. It was owned at the time by Robert Jarvis. For the old timers, that was Beep Beep Portland Jeep Jarvis, who was an interesting fellow too. So that started out as a lease of that space, and then substantial remodeling that was done, and ultimately they acquired the deed to the house. And I was involved in that.
Do you know memories of the? It was on 15th Avenue between Alberta and Killingsworth.
I remember being there once or twice, but I wasn't there every day or on a regular basis.
Well, for the ones that you did, for the Hoyt house that you do have more vivid memories of, what are your memories of the physicality of Our New Beginnings?
Well, it was mildly chaotic. It was whatever the antithesis is of institutional. I mean that obviously the living space, the women's rooms, the residences, but most of the stuff everywhere, office and rooms and everything else, was donated. And so you had that kind of mishmash. But Carole's office was also full of stuffed animals and as well as books and files and stuff all over everywhere, because she was just, always, she was not the most orderly person, let's put it that way.
Did you get to know some of the women?
I did. That was a huge thing for me and in my life. I had a very sheltered upbringing. I think I had some cousins who got in trouble with the law, once upon a time or something. But basically, I had a very straight and narrow, so to speak, upbringing and sheltered existence. And so meeting and really getting to know some of these women involved in the criminal justice system was like, oh, they're just people. They're people who have very different life stories than mine, made different choices, had different experiences, didn't have opportunities, and so on and so forth. But it was tremendously important to me in terms of it being a humanizing experience, if you will. And the other part of it that was so helpful to me in getting to know a lot of these, the residents or clients personally, was that made a huge difference to me when I became a judge. I remember one day in particular, I was sitting around with several of the women on the stairs or something, some Saturday work project, I don't know what it was. And we were chatting, and someone was asking me about my life, my work. And I talked about, my daily and weekly routine, getting up and going to work in the law office, and, they were asking me how much vacation time I had and that kind of thing. And the reaction, this anxiety started rising among these women. It's like, ooh, that felt so restrictive to them. They couldn't imagine having to do that all day, every day. And at the same time, I'm talking to them about, wow, when I drive down the street, if I see lights on a police car anywhere behind me, I'm like, oh my gosh, have I done something wrong? The whole idea of even being stopped by the police is just terrifying. I have been socialized the way we hope people are socialized, right? And for so many of these women, it was like, no big deal. There's just no anxiety associated with it, or very little, I should say. Nothing compared to what I had. It was part of their life. It was part of everybody they knew, had been arrested, had been in jail, a lot of them had been to prison. So the anxiety that we hope will be a deterrent just had no place for them. And I thought, this is just fascinating. And how people like me think, what people like me think that others will respond to in terms of changing their behavior or deterring behavior does not apply. And I learned from something Carole had told me, certainly a lot of her clients confirmed, that especially those who are involved in prostitution, a street life, often associated with drugs and drug addiction, for them, it wasn't rare that being arrested was a relief. It wasn't just a lack of anxiety, it was a relief. They got off the street, maybe away from a pimp, and got, as they say, 3 hots and a cot. So it was almost a respite for many of them. And for prostitution in particular, with that level of offense, they weren't going to prison, and the jail terms weren't going to be very long. So I thought, wow, it's a real eye-opener for me.
Well, then, I think a very natural way to go is kind of talking about your career, because I'm curious, basically, how that window into that psyche, that reality of a completely different population, how that informed your work. So I think I know from Rick's interview, I think you're first in your class at Willamette?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, can you kind of take me through the journey of what people become different things for different reasons? What was your motivation to become a lawyer? Did you know you wanted to become a judge? And then how did getting that very intimate kind of relationship with those women inform you? Because you spent over 2 decades on the bench, right?
I did,
yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, when I was in high school, a good friend of mine and classmate said to me one day, you should be a lawyer. We should both be lawyers, and we can practice together. I didn't know any lawyers personally. There were no lawyers in my family. I knew Perry Mason and Bobby Kennedy. Those were my lawyers. And E.G. Marshall on the Defenders on television. But I thought, that sounds intriguing. I was involved in student politics. I was on the debate team. I like to argue in all kinds of other forums. So I thought, it sort of clicked. that, oh, law, okay. So off I went. I went to Willamette as an undergraduate. There was no particular pre-law major, but I knew that's where I wanted to go if I could get there. I went right through undergraduate 4 years and entered Willamette Law School. And fortunately, I did well. It was one of those, because I did have this panic that, what if I'm no good at this? And then what am I going to do? And I had the incredible opportunity to clerk for a federal judge for 2 years when I graduated. And this was for Otto Scopel, who, when I started my clerkship with him, was the chief judge of the district court for the District of Oregon, which is the trial court. And partway into my clerkship, he was elevated to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So I got to work a year on the trial court with him and a year on the Ninth Circuit. It was just a phenomenal experience. And, of course, working for Otto Scopel anywhere doing anything would have been an incredible experience. He was just a remarkable man and a remarkable judge. And a lot of people think that either I knew I wanted to be a judge when I sought the clerkship, or the clerkship made me realize I wanted to be a judge. And that's not true, at least not consciously so. I mean, a seed may have been planted, but I had no ideas that, I want to be a judge someday. Instead, as I said, I went to work at the law firm. I had wonderful colleagues like Rick Hazelton and others, and I was given fantastic opportunities as a baby lawyer. But it was all civil. It was all civil litigation. I did no criminal work. But as time went by, I know this sounds kind of odd, but as wonderful as the experiences were that I had, I started getting this nagging feeling there was something else I was supposed to be doing. And some people by that time were saying to me or asking me, have you ever thought about being a judge? I think you'd be a good judge. So that got me thinking about whether that was something I would want to pursue, and I talked to some judges about it. Now, there's definitely a connection here with Carole Pope and that story, because I really believe I would not have become a judge but for Carole and Our New Beginnings. Because working with Carole and New Beginnings, I met Mike Shrunk, the district attorney, and some other rather powerful and important people in the community. I mean, Carole was hobnobbing with Arlene Schnitzer and Jane Bryson and all kinds of folks, and it was Carole who introduced those folks to me. And because of what I saw with Our New Beginnings, and I knew from that work something about the corrections side and the community corrections side, what was going on in terms of parole and probation, work release in the community, and that kind of thing. So I got involved. I was appointed to the Community Corrections Advisory Committee. And in fact, I became chair of the Community Corrections Advisory Committee. So I learned quite a bit about the corrections side and sort of that part of the criminal justice system from that side, without ever actually having practiced any criminal law. But because I knew Mike Shrunk through that exposure, when I decided I wanted to explore maybe becoming a judge, I talked to Mike because they had a program in the district attorney's office at that time. I don't remember what the formal name for it was, but the people called it DA for a day. And it was designed to serve two purposes. One, to help out the DA's office, but also to help out especially newer lawyers in the big firms doing civil litigation practice who never got to go to court. They could spend big chunks of their career in the library and writing motions and maybe going to court to argue a motion, but they never got to try a case. Part of what was going on is civil trials were going away in general. Anyway, but it was a great fit. So these younger, newer associates could come in, pick up for a several-week period, 1 day a week, pick up their files the evening before for a bunch of trials, misdemeanors, scheduled to be tried the next day, come in early the next morning, meet with the witnesses, who were mostly police officers, and go into court and sort out with the defense attorneys what was going to happen. Some of them ended up in pleas and so on, but usually, if you were lucky, you had some trials that came out of them. So you got your little, the trial that took a day, misdemeanor trial, And so even though by that time I was a partner and had been a partner at this firm, and I tried some significant civil cases, I knew I was missing that piece, the criminal trial side. So I talked to Mike and I said, could I do the DA for a Day program? And he said, sure. So I had the opportunity to actually get a little bit, fill that gap, that blank spot on my resume when it came time to apply to be a judge. So I first applied to the court to be a judge in 1990. I don't know if you want the background, but most in Oregon, state judges are elected to 6-year terms. But the way most of us become judges in the first place is by appointment when there's a vacancy. Because people don't generally, I mean, it happens, but it's not common for somebody to run against a sitting judge. If that judge has done a decent job, it's kind of hard to unseat them. So anyway, there was a vacancy. Neil Goldschmidt was still governor. I applied and not surprisingly didn't get it. Lots of people apply many, many times who are highly qualified and never get to become judges, so there's a lot of luck. I always acknowledge that. Anyway, in fact, Roosevelt Robinson was appointed by Governor Goldschmidt to that vacancy. And then Barbara Roberts was elected, and there was a vacancy that came up then in the spring of 1991 when Robert Kirkman was caught up in a bigamy scandal. Anyway, so he stepped down and there was a vacancy on the district court, and I applied again, and I was the first judge appointed by Barbara Roberts to the district court. And then 2 years later, there was a vacancy on the circuit court. Now, the district court was consolidated with the circuit court several years ago, but at that time we had a district court and a circuit court, and so Governor Roberts appointed me again to the circuit court. But not only did I have the support at that point of Mike Shrunk and other people that I'd worked with in the community corrections side, but I'd been involved in a lot of bar activities and other community things and so on as well. But the introduction that I had to both those activities and those people, influential people, through Carroll was quite significant. I mean, I met Barbara Roberts through Carroll in the first place. I mean, she knew all these people. So not only would I probably not have become a judge but for that relationship, but that experience that I had with Carroll in New Beginnings very much influenced how I viewed the world and the people who were appearing before me.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about just the implications of something like that. It's a very profound thing in its own way. So at your time, so just for timeline thing, you guys met in 81. When did you guys part ways?
It was kind of an amorphous process. So that's a little hard to pin down, but it was, because she had moved, we were no longer living together for several years before. It was pretty clear that we were done. The relationship was really over at the personal level, and that was pretty clear by 1990.
Oh, so your relationship, in a way, did span almost the entire history of Our New Beginnings, though.
Mm-hmm.
Did she... When you were appointed, I'm just curious about just your, because you have the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
That's mine. I apologize. I should have thought of that before we started. Put that on your checklist. I'm so sorry.
Okay, it's added to my checklist for the future. What was I asking? I was asking about your guys' relationship. It went for almost the length of Our New Beginnings. What was I? Did I ask the question?
No.
Darn. Well, I guess what I'm curious about ultimately is you got to know a side of her that no one I've talked to got to know. because you had a personal relationship there in a different kind of way. The stories I get of Carole are, you say certain things that absolutely almost everybody else has said, the charisma, the kind of fierceness, but with the playful side. So I'm curious that when, I know Our New Beginnings started to fall apart in 91, which is the same year you were being appointed to the bench. Were you guys still in contact? Like, was she happy for you? Did you guys talk about it?
Oh, she was thrilled. She was my biggest fan and probably happier than anybody else when I got that appointment. She was beside herself. I got little congratulatory gifts from her and from New Beginnings, for wishing me well on my way.
I'll go back and ask you more questions about Our New Beginnings. I'm just curious from your point of view on it. But New Beginnings fell apart shortly after that. Do you have memories of when you first did hear that it was kind of closing, for lack of better terms?
Well, I knew that there was a struggle. Things were never easy for a program, for New Beginnings, or frankly, a lot of programs like it. I mean, getting it started, getting people interested, getting grant money, establishing the credibility eventually for contracts, for work release and those services. And New Beginnings got a grant from the Oregon Community Foundation, seed money grant that was enormously helpful in getting started. And from the Fred Meyer Foundation. But she knew Judith Rooks and other folks on the Oregon Community Foundation. She knew all those people too. But Fred Meyer was enormously helpful. But seed money means seed money. It means that we're going to help you get going. This is not intended to be ongoing operational funds that you can count on forever. We're going to help you get on your feet. Once you're on your feet, you're going to be finding the money from elsewhere, which is sometimes hard to do. And even though grant money from other sources is, for operational expenses, is often available on an ongoing basis, I mean, the way the world works is sometimes you're today's shiny new thing that everybody wants to give to. And then you're not the shiny, not that you've done anything wrong or haven't done exactly what you said you do with the money or aren't showing great successes, but just because you're not the shiny new thing anymore and another shiny new thing has come along, it's harder to keep the money coming. And then on the contract side, for example, providing work release and treatment and so on for the residents, it was difficult to get contracts for the length of service that Carole thought was essential to, and you often use the word Band-Aid, and she'd say, I will not do Band-Aids. I refuse to do Band-Aids. I won't do it. There are no 90-day wonders. That was another one of her phrases. I won't do those kinds of things. It's not going to be effective, and I don't want a contract that limits me, is only going to pay me to provide services, those limited services. So she was constantly fighting to get contracts that provided things more extensively. And there were problems too, because I think that Carole's view, and of course you know what Carole herself said about it, she felt that she was betrayed by the government agencies that were contracting with her to provide these services. And they were just sort of using Our New Beginnings temporarily while they were building all these prisons. And once the prison beds were there, they needed to fill those beds and weren't interested in having people at New Beginnings anymore. There's probably an element of truth to that, as there often is the way things go. But I think it was much more complicated than that. It was, at a certain point, a program like New Beginnings can't just run on the energy of one woman. And conversely, at some point, one woman, even a woman with the energy that Carole Pope had, can't sustain it herself on her charisma. And people expect things to be a little bit more regularized and institutionalized, if you will, which is something Carole always balked at horribly. That was just not her style. And so that caused, frictions and tensions. The ideal, I think, that everybody had would have been to get a little more regularized or institutionalized, figure out what's working. Can we figure out what this is? Can we write it down? Can we describe it? So that other people can come in and run it and do the same thing. And that was very hard to do. It's hard to, pin things down. And Carole wanted it, but she also didn't want it. I mean, it was so much a part of her identity that I think she had this horrible tension in her own life about that, about bringing people in and letting them take over what needed to be taken over. She, as I think you know from other people, had a great deal of difficulty taking care of herself. That was apparent early on. I mean, early on in our relationship, she was just running herself ragged because she smoked like a chimney. But, she'd get a call in the middle of the night from a client who was in trouble and needed to be picked up someplace. And Carole would go and not pay attention to her own needs or nutrition or anything. I mean, she lived on nicotine and caffeine, and she was still drinking, actually, in early days, but she stopped. I don't know that she ever really dealt with her own alcoholism. She stopped drinking. That's a different thing. But I think if she was afraid, if she stopped, New Beginnings would fall apart, and I think she was afraid she didn't know what would happen, what would become of herself. That was what she was. It was so much part of her identity. And I think being a martyr became part of her persona and identity. So I think it's not uncommon for an organization that is founded on somebody who is incredibly charismatic, that I would guess a lot of those organizations aren't sustainable. So that was part of it. Part of it was the political part and the financial part. Part of it was not being the shiny new thing anymore. Other organizations picking things up. Some of it was New Beginnings being, if you will, a victim of its own success, in terms of educating people about needs, in terms of persuading people about what was necessary for treatment programs, especially for women, in terms of identifying the fact that the vast majority of the women in the criminal justice system, regardless of what their crime was, had been the victims of abuse, sexual abuse, often as children, and that you can do all the regular drug treatment you want, you can do all the regular whatever treatment you want, but if you don't address that underlying issue and acknowledge that and take it on, you're not going to get anywhere. And other treatment programs started recognizing that. So some of the other drug treatment programs and so on, substance abuse treatment programs, were starting to address some of those other issues too. I would call that a success. But it means there was sort of that competition, if you will, for what New Beginnings was providing. And, Carole's view of what she wanted to be able to provide. I recently came across a radio interview that she did at New Beginnings' 10th birthday, and she described her vision of finding a place in the country, a rural setting, and having, she called them her women, there for 18 months, and then bringing them back to a house in the city for 6 months to kind of get that acclimation piece. But boy, I think you're going to find some place. How are you going to get the funding for 2 years to provide that kind of support for people? I'm not saying it wasn't a great idea, and it would have been a wonderful thing. But when that's where the vision's going, and she's pressing for it longer and longer, it just wasn't going to happen.
Working counter to the reality of how our society is structured now. Right. When, not to make it too dramatic, but kind of your career was hitting a high moment while hers was hitting a very low moment, did you worry about her, what she would do next? Or was she the kind of person that you just knew she'd find something else?
Well, oddly, I may have been one of those people who, even seeing the handwriting on the wall, just couldn't quite believe it was actually going to completely go away. Somehow there was going to be some new savior who was going to come in. It's not that I had withdrawn my support. New Beginnings had gone way beyond my being a person who picked up a bill now and again, or made sure that Carole was okay even if she couldn't draw a salary. It was way past that. But Carole could always pull a rabbit out of a hat. And I had, by the time things were that bad, I was still in contact with her, but not nearly as frequently, and I was not as involved with New Beginnings affairs. I wasn't on the board anymore. I was kind of on an advisory, a more removed advisory capacity. But I think in my memory, the critical thing was that New Beginnings needed some additional money to make the last payment on the house when they bought it or something. I don't remember how it worked. And it just wasn't there. It wasn't to be had. They had to give up the house. If we give up the house, everything's gone in terms of any opportunity for contracts or work release. There are no beds, and so on and so forth. So I think I didn't realize how bad it was until it really went. And of course, Carole's health problems were getting, from what I heard, worse and worse. Things coming and going, but
yeah, I was curious. Well, you had used kind of like tie a couple questions I have into one kind of. You had mentioned the energy of one woman, kind of like this kind of sort of cult of personality, an entire thing built on it. Mm-hmm. I had read that she had several strokes and a heart attack. Did any of that happen in your time?
Yes. Well, I don't know about several. She had at least one stroke when we were together. In fact, not very far into it, because I told her she was, running on caffeine and cigarettes and not taking care of herself. And I remember having a conversation. I said, Carole, you can't keep doing this. You're going to have a stroke. And within the next year, she had her first stroke.
Did it change her behaviors?
No.
It's interesting because what I wanted to ask you about, but listening to you talk, I wanted to ask you, when she went to prison, this is a woman who had, she was a child prodigy on the piano, she had 2 master's degrees, is it music and German literature? She goes to prison, and her identity quickly, instead of becoming this accomplished woman, becomes the ex-con.
Right.
But she finds a purpose. When she gets out, she has a drive and a passion and an anger, even a rage, I think she describes it, for this cause. So you actually got to be a person very close to her. What I wanted to ask is, what was it like watching that bloom? But it seems like that blooming came at a cost to the human who was blooming, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a fire, and it's consuming. And, I don't know, as I said, she's the most charismatic person I ever met. I've not known personally any other creative, any other geniuses in that way. She was a genius. There's no question in my mind. But from books and movies, I think that's actually may not be that uncommon for that passion to consume the person who has it. But you talk about the change in a persona, and that's true. But part of what was amazing and fascinating about Carole is that she still had those sides. And I learned early on. She told me early on that she played the piano. I heard that that she was teaching piano when she was committed a crime and was convicted. But I didn't really, I thought, oh well, okay, there's some people who are kind of musical in my family, and then one day we went to a piano store, and Carole had been into this piano store before. I went with her because, you see the pictures. She's kind of scruffy looking and rough looking, and I can imagine the first time she walks into this piano store, somebody steps in front of the grand and, says, "Can I help you?" But because she'd been in there before, she didn't have that kind of reaction. And instead, she sits down and starts playing. And it was just amazing. I mean, it was amazing. My jaw dropped. And not just, she could sit down and pretty good. She sits down and starts playing the Rachmaninoff piano concerto. So again, as part of it, that was part of her attraction for me. Honestly, it was like, wow, this. But because she could speak she wasn't just the con or the ex-con, although she could play that because for real she'd been there perfectly. She knew the language, she knew the register. She could speak that way, which gave her enormous credibility with the clients. But it's the person who sat down at the piano and played the Rachmaninoff piano concerto who developed the relationship with Arlene Schnitzer. And had developed credibility with Mike Shrunk because she could speak as this highly educated, very articulate, intelligent person, depending on where she was. Which is why I'm sure many people had the idea of something like New Beginnings, developing some kind of support network for women coming out of prison, had seen the need for it, but couldn't carry it out because they couldn't develop the credibility with the sources they need, either for funding or with judges. When early on, she'd go to court with a client and encouraging the judge to put this person on probation and let Carole work with her, let her work with New Beginnings. She knew how to talk to the judge and establish that credibility. And then, of course, her actions were essential to maintaining that credibility. And she did have it. She speaks in this radio interview about sort of sitting on the fence or being on a fence all the time with regard to her actions. And that is, the clients had to trust her to come with her and stay with her. But the judges had to trust her, and the parole and probation officers had to trust her, that if there was a problem, if there was, misbehavior, if there were violations, Carole wouldn't tolerate it. She would, as she'd say, drop the dime. And I heard Carole say more than once to a client, and if New Beginnings' success and Carole's success boils down to anything, it's this. This was true. Carole would say to the client, "I will do anything for you. I will do everything I can to help you." Stuff that was beyond anything anybody should have been doing. Carole didn't know boundaries very well, but anything I can to help you. But if you screw up, I will drive you back to prison myself. So she scared him to death. On one hand, she had him because they knew she meant it when she said she'd do whatever she could to help. She would literally give somebody the shirt off her back. And obviously she did much of what she did at tremendous cost, personal cost to herself and her health. But it was also true that she'd pick up the phone. What I later learned, this was also a really important lesson for me as a judge, was that those weren't always conflicting statements. Let me try to explain that. I saw both women who'd gone through New Beginnings, and also a couple of times I was on a panel once with some women who had not been to New Beginnings, but they were talking about, it was in an education setting, a panel, and they were talking about what made a difference when you were successful and when you weren't. If you'd been in prison and you were out and you violated your parole and went back in, you came back out, you were ultimately successful, what made the difference in your success? Is it just burnout? Which sometimes it is. People age out of the system, but what makes a difference? And in all these contexts, there was a theme that I heard. It was, someone cared about me. And clearly you see that would be what the people who were New Beginnings would say, and that was Carole and other members of her staff who really deeply cared. But sometimes someone would say it was a judge or it was a probation officer. But here's the part I'm getting to. They'd say, this person cared about me enough to send me to prison. Now, doesn't that sound strange? But what I took from that, what I learned from that, is that meant that this person cared about me enough and thought enough of me and believed enough that I could do better, that they held me to that standard. And when I say that definitely influenced me as a judge and how I dealt with people I sentenced and people I had on probation. And if I could just take a minute to, it's not a New Beginning story, but it comes directly out of this. I was leaving the courthouse one day over the noon hour, go out for lunch, and I heard somebody say, with a guy, say, Judge Wilson? Are you Judge Wilson? And I'm like, who wants to know? You do have a little bit about your personal safety, but and I said, yeah. And the guy looked kind of familiar, but I couldn't remember his name. And he was wearing, chef's houndstooth check pants and white shirt. Anyway, and he told me his name, and he said, "You sent me to prison. You revoked my probation and sent me to prison. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I want to thank you. Can I give you a hug?" And I've actually had some other stories that weren't quite that dramatic, but similar along those lines. So we talked for a few minutes, and I remembered that case, and I remembered what happened. And when he was in, and it wasn't the first time he'd violated his probation, he's in court, and his mother's there, and his mother's like, "Oh, my poor baby, and he just, he's not, don't send him to prison. He's not a criminal." And, which was one of many occasions where I had said, "You don't understand, people are in prison who've committed crimes. Your son is by definition a criminal. He's been convicted of a crime. Being a criminal doesn't mean you're a worthless person." But clearly she had been trying to protect him and defend him, but also she was not holding him accountable for his own behavior. And he reminded me that at that hearing, she said, "My mom was not being helpful to me." And you turned to me and you said, "I know you can do better than this. I know you're capable of doing better than this and not engaging in that behavior that you're doing. And I'm sending you to prison not because I think you're worthless and we're going to throw you away. I'm sending you to prison because I'm holding you accountable. I know you're better." And he said that was his life-changing experience. I don't want to say I changed his life, but it was. But that's because I learned that lesson from Carole and from New Beginnings. And I think that what she did and the approach she took, mine was actually much more, intimate and direct and personal with Carole and with the other residents, but I think it influenced a lot of judges.
I know there's stories of judges calling the house and asking, calling Carole and asking, "I have so-and-so, kind of, what would you do?" Were you ever privy to any of those kind of conversations with people asking her opinion on a particular case?
Oh, I knew she didn't give me details, but I knew she did get calls from judges about clients or somebody that she had.
For the kind of consumption of the consumptive fire, as you kind of put it, did it spill into your personal life? And did clients come to your home, or did you always go to Our New Beginnings, to that home?
Clients rarely came to our house. It's not never, but it was rare. It was mostly, our going to New Beginnings, and having contact there and elsewhere.
For a number of the former clients, some of whom became employees of Our New Beginnings, I know that holidays were a really special, big thing for them. And they talk about stories about how it was clearly a drive in Carroll to have these very festive celebrations. I know that she was quoted in her oral history of saying she wanted to give them a childhood. She wanted to give them the childhood that many of them didn't have, basically. So my question to you, as someone who has the intimacy with Our New Beginnings, intimacy with Carole, was she trying to? I know she had a very, using the scare quotes, a very tragic childhood with the abuse and the alcoholism. Was she giving herself the childhood she never had.
Absolutely. I mean, I shouldn't say absolutely. I think so. It certainly looked that way to me. She wanted it not only for them, but for herself. And much of what she did, I think, she was trying to save herself. I don't think she realized that, but it was trying to make sure that you can't undo what happened in somebody's childhood or prevent what happened in their childhood, but to finally have the redemption, the healing that she never had.
Was she playful as a person?
Oh, that was another one of the incredible parts of her really complex personality, is that she could be very playful and very childlike. I said her office was full of stuffed animals. That wasn't just, the therapeutic stuffed animals for the client stuff. That was Carole, especially if it was purple, People would give her things, but she would see them and want them and have them for herself. And she loved, puppies and kittens and very much that way. Often very, I would say, childlike. Sometimes childish a little bit. It was like, whoa, what's this about? But she just did everything full-heartedly. Not just wholeheartedly, full-heartedly. I think it's a little bit different quality there.
I had heard stories that she either had something with horses. Did she have horses?
She didn't have any horses when we were together.
Had you heard stories?
I'd heard stories that she'd had horses when she lived in Missouri or something. I mean, this is before. And she had an affinity for horses. But it wouldn't surprise me if at one she had a friend who had acreage and had a horse and gave one to Carole, or Carole got one or something that she had before. Wouldn't surprise me at all. But I don't remember. Either I never knew the details, or I don't remember. I couldn't keep up with all that stuff.
Well, how about rocks? Did she collect rocks when you
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Is this something she spoke about? Or is it just something that you just knew that Carole was into rocks?
Oh, how about seeing them? The thunder eggs, the things she'd pick up, the crystals, the geodes, especially, again, amethyst. Can't beat amethyst because it's purple. She'd have those things all over.
Is it just something that she did? Was there, in the analysis of someone and collecting something, was there anything behind it that she ever spoke about, or is it just a connection to the earth and the sun?
Not that she ever spoke about to me, so I couldn't analyze it for you.
Did you guys have pets, or you had art in the beginning?
We had mini cats.
Oh.
We had. What's the poster say? I'm one cat short of being a cat lady. We might not have been one cat short of being. Yeah. At one time we had 7 cats.
Did our New Beginnings have pets?
There was a small dog who lived at New Beginnings. I can't remember the dog's name right now. Little blonde dog that was there for a while. I can't remember if there were any cats there. It's always more challenging with cats because more people have allergies.
I know that people like Carole became like Nana to
yes.
a number of people.
Yes.
Was that something that you also had a connection to some of the children of our New Beginnings?
The first human birth that I ever witnessed, the only human birth I ever witnessed, was a New Beginnings client delivering her baby at OHSU. And I'd known the client, so she was comfortable with my being there. And when she went into labor, I went with Carole, and there was another staff person, I think, who was there. I went with her, and it was one of those, kind of classic moments too, where labor's very painful, and she's saying, "I can't do this," and everybody's saying, "It's too late for that, sweetheart," And it was, boy. I mean, again, all the cliches apply. What an incredible miracle it was. But that was the only birth I was there for. But I was definitely around for when other clients had children. There was one who was, called at the time a crack baby, with some of those, incessant crying and difficult to comfort behavioral things, and Carole decided to take on personally. And but yeah, she was very much attached to those children and they to her.
When a person like Carole or an organization like Our New Beginnings leaves your life in in a big way, not being in the daily or weekly part of your life, was it a felt loss to you? Did you miss anything about Our New Beginnings?
Yes. It's complicated. It's all complicated. One of the things about New Beginnings and my role with Carole in New Beginnings, and Carole and I actually talked about this, is that I was sort of the ballast in the ship, or with the other analogy, we had two other analogies we used. I was the anchor, or the tail on the kite. All of those things are trying to provide, or trying to actually hold something back and provide balance. And I think the kite one is one that Carole and I used more than once, because a kite without a tail will fly, but it will fly all over everywhere, and be not very stable and hard to direct, and so on and so forth. And the tail kind of helps keep. So that really was a lot my role, and I was proud to help Carole, to help New Beginnings, in that way, to be a part of this thing that I thought was amazing and phenomenal. That was a gift to me in my life, to be able to help in some little way. But being the anchor or the tail on the kite, it's kind of a drag. I mean, emotionally as well as physically. And it was hard because Carole could not be confined or kept, or even really stabilized. So it was extremely wearing. And glad to be helpful when I could be, but Carole wouldn't always take my advice, often wouldn't take my advice, and to see her being consumed by that fire, to see her being unable to take care of herself. You can't be very long. We can't be forever with somebody who can't take care of herself. She can't really be a full participant in a relationship. And it became obvious to me that was the way it was going to be. And, we've probably talked to other people who were close to Carole who felt that that relationship sort of burned them out. They just couldn't deal with that intensity all the time. So that happened to me, but boy, it's hard not to miss being with around that kind of energy or a program that really is making those kind of miracles. If I actually hadn't read some of the material, know that it's out there, sometimes I would think I must have dreamt this stuff up, because that couldn't have really happened. The Hollywood folks coming and talking about doing a movie. I do remember we sat around joking about who was going to play me.
Who'd you cast?
I wanted Vanessa Redgrave.
Good choice. Excellent choice.
In the movie. But anyway, so we were joking about those things. But, the Time magazine stuff, the, Unsung Heroes, Christian Science Monitor articles, and wow. But it's not that I missed sort of being around fame so much as that positive energy and that, seeing lives changed and saved in a really profound way.
Yeah, being too close to that fire, it gives lives, it takes lives. Yep. If you stand too close, you get burned. Yep. For what Our New Beginnings did, my understanding is it had mental health counseling for drug, alcohol, incest, prostitution. It had parenting classes, it had job training, it had financial literacy, it had life skills classes, it had medical and dental, which I'm assuming for many of those things I just listed was the first time that some of these women ever had any of that in their adult life, or maybe potentially in their life, period. Right. I don't know exactly everything that, I'm not 100% sure of how the judicial system works, but from what you did on the bench and knowing that Our New Beginnings was completely gone by 92, maybe it's trailed on a little bit with Carroll's activities into 93. Mm-hmm. Do you see or feel there is a great need for something like that today?
Oh, absolutely. No, there's just no question. You can see a defendant, whether it's especially at sentencing in the first instance, but then if they're on probation and problems develop, that there are enormous needs here. And for all kinds of treatment and education and so on and so on and so forth. And easy to say, hard to do. And what do we do as judges is put somebody on probation and list a number of conditions. Well, you need to do this you have to successfully complete this treatment, do this kind of counseling, get this, do that. But there aren't the resources out there to get them, to help them, to find them. And you got probation officers who are overwhelmed, focused by reasons of policy decisions. I'm not going to get into criticizing those on more violent offenders because of the community safety risk. They're not spending the time on the lower level offenders. And as time went by, especially as budget cycles went as they did and they went down, resources and support for the lower level offenders got worse. And even having a probation officer with the time to help somebody to hook them up to the resources. Even if those programs are out there, this was one of the other wonderful things about New Beginnings, one-stop shopping. Instead of, okay, where do I find a program for this? And where do I find the program for that? And people try to develop resource lists, but things change. And who's got a bed now for this? Who's got an opening for that? What does it cost? Are there subsidies for a particular kind of program? I don't know that I could navigate that stuff sometimes. I really do. I think about that. One time early on in my days as a judge, I just thought, I'm going to pretend that I was just sentenced for some misdemeanor, DUI, for example, driving under the influence, and I know what the standard conditions are. And I'm going to go see what it's like to try and sign up for this stuff and comply. Go down and stand in line at the window on the first floor, and of course I didn't have the right paperwork, but anyway, I'd say I'm supposed to do blah, 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 and see what kind of information I got and how hard it was to navigate. And it was hard. And that's with my level of education. And that's, for me, not having all kinds of other stresses in my life, including having just been convicted of a crime and told to do all these things. And we know that having a lot of stress impairs people's cognitive abilities, regardless of how well they've measured up and you lose a whole bunch of IQ points when you're under stress. So it's harder to navigate. So, oh my gosh, I saw the lack of that kind of thing many times as a judge.
Well, kind of wrapping up sort of here, getting towards the end, I have a number of questions of just what is the most profound memory you have of an actual event happening at Our New Beginnings?
Oh boy.
Or is it more just a sea of memories?
It is. I can't, there wasn't sort of a big, it was momentous to get a new contract, but the biggest part of the memories are the emotional memories. And
this might be a harder one even.
Okay.
Make them harder here. How would you verbalize how knowing Carole changed you?
Well, I've already described in many ways how eye-opening it was, but and how it changed my perspective as a judge and as a person. How did it change? How am I different? I could say what I could say is, I got to touch that flame. That was pretty amazing. And part of me feels guilty for not having sort of hung in there, and I don't think I could have saved New Beginnings even if I did. But I'm also grateful that I got to be a part of Carol's life and a part of New Beginnings and see that really up close and personal. And so I did, as I said, I sort of feel guilty about part of that, but part of it is in hindsight too, and looking back and thinking, I helped. I'm not saying somebody else wouldn't have been there, and New Beginnings couldn't have made it, and Carole wouldn't have done what she was able to do if I hadn't been there personally, if it hadn't been me. But it was me.
It was
I did have a role. Carole saved lots of lives, and I helped.
Did you guys remain friends?
We did. We didn't have a lot of contact. We'd talk on the phone from time to time. We saw each other occasionally, but not very often, especially as she got, more ill. But we'd get together for coffee. But those were even the phone calls were emotionally exhausting.
Could you see, if you did have that contact, did you see a decline in health?
Oh yeah. She looked horrible.
Did it kind of happen quickly after she lost New Beginnings?
Well, I'd say the decline had started actually before that. And who knows, what was cause and effect in that, whether, as I said, she could have pulled a rabbit out of the hat yet another time, but for the fact that her health was declining, or it was the loss that was such a blow. I mean, no question it was such a blow. It sort of did her in. But yeah, it was definitely more precipitous after New Beginnings closed.
How did her, what was your takeaway for her memorial service? How did it seem like a representative gathering of her life? Celebration of her life?
Yeah, I thought it was very well done. And in some ways, I think the scale was too small for who Carole was and what she did. I mean, really, it should have been in the Schnitzer Auditorium. And, so the things that were said and the materials that were out there for people to see and look at, it was fine as far as it went. And I was so grateful that the people organized it and did that. But really, for who she was and what she did, it should have been even bigger. It should have been the Memorial Coliseum.
Two more questions. Actually, no, I have one more question.
Okay.
Which basically is just, do you have any, if you were telling the history of either Carole or New Beginnings, how would you write it? What's something that I'm not asking you that I should have asked?
I can't think of anything. I think you've been very thorough.
Yeah, I mean, I have this, having you sitting across the table is one of those things where I've asked so many other questions, but you know everything from a completely different, the home life. Everyone knows that fire that, went through in her purple shirt and her purple chair that either was a great chair for some people or a horrifying chair to other people. but you get to know the woman in a different way. And I guess I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Did she ever just break down? Or was that something she wouldn't allow for herself to have?
See, just break down. To me, that is the description of someone who is just sobbing in a puddle, which I never saw Carole do. Did she cry sometimes? And yeah, she did, but very rarely, very publicly. You'd see more tears of anger than tears of frustration or sadness at loss in a public way. But the other part was there. I'm not a psychologist, but I think that part of it was, publicly Carole had to, put on, be the, tough, keep that tough persona. But even at the personal level, I think she had so many wounds, so many internal injuries that she was never able to really touch, that even at that personal level, she couldn't fully go there. I think she was afraid she would never come back out. So even with me, and I think I got to see, more of that than anybody else did. But even there, she couldn't really go there.
Do you have any final comments on our new bidding gangs or Carole?
No.
I said plenty. It's awesome. Thank you.